Railroading as an industry began in the eastern seaboard, with the Appalachian Mountains separating the civilized world from the far and unknown. As railroads began threading their way through these mountains and out the other side, though, this was the land that greeted them. There would be plenty of room here for farmers, industrialists, and entrepreneurs to settle down and start their new lives, with railroads moving their raw materials in bulk from producers to consumers. As far as the eye could see, nothing seemed to stand in their way. You join us at the geographic center of railroading in the Midwest. Chicago stands as the undisputed railroad capital of America, and for good reason. Since the first train rolled into Chicago, the city has become a natural hub for moving by water, air, and land. At its peak, nearly 20 railroads crossed each other and spread out in all directions. Despite the mergers and consolidations, the pace of rail traffic is still unchanged to the casual observer. For a more in-depth look of what it used to be like, the best place to look is only 50 miles out in the country. The Illinois Railway Museum is one of the oldest and the largest museums of its kind in the country. Spread out over 80 acres next to the town of Union, this is the home to literally hundreds of pieces of equipment, including locomotives, rolling stock, streetcars, rapid transit cars, and structures that illustrate what past railroading was like in Chicagoland. At special events like their Museum Showcase Weekend, the best of their collection is shown off in the best light. The most recognizable exhibit is Frisco 1630, the Russian decapod, so named for a group of locomotives intended for Russian export in the 1910s. When the Bolshevik Revolution hit in 1917, canceling the order, the remainder of this batch were picked up by various American railroads. The 1630 would end up settling on the branch lines of the St. Louis-San Francisco Railroad. The 1630 served on the Frisco until 1951 and was eventually donated here in 1967. She's the museum's flagship steam locomotive. Today leading this consist of heavyweight passenger cars up and down the 5-mile-long main line. The 1630 is joined by another gem in the collection, the so-called Train of the Goddesses. The Nebraska Zephyr was born in the streamliner craze. Running between Chicago and Lincoln, Nebraska, this train was one of dozens of Zephyr streamliners that the Burlington route rostered in the 1930s, branching out to points west like Minneapolis, Denver, Houston, and Oakland. Each of the 5 articulated cars are named after Greek goddesses, in tradition with the Burlington naming their streamliners after characters in Greek mythology. They are pulled along by the 9911A, also known as Silver Pilot, a 1940 vintage E5 from the Electromotive Corporation. Following their retirements in 1968, long after passenger rail travel had been surpassed by the automobile and jet airliner, the Zephyr train set and the Silver Pilot were donated by the Burlington to the museum. While there are dozens more locomotives and rolling stock in the collection, the museum is also built on the heritage of electric streetcars and interurbans, many of them hailing from Chicagoland. Some were the last of their kind to operate in Chicago, while others operated as close as Milwaukee, and some as far away as Mexico. They travel the property on a mile-long loop of track, but some can run on the main line too. These two rapid transit cars once hustled riders around the L from 1922 to 1973, while these two interurban cars used to carry passengers between Chicago and Milwaukee. Hundreds more historic pieces are on display indoors and out, with some getting to shine at other events throughout the year. It can take an entire day to view the entire collection, which is still expanding as vintage equipment becomes surplus out in the real world. For the average train watcher, that length of time could be spent watching the endless parade of progress under that catenary wire. It is museums like IRM that provide the space for these old railroad and traction relics to enjoy their retirement in peace. But it is not uncommon to see the old exchange whistle greetings with the new, as the Union Pacific Main Line runs parallel with the museum property. From the northeastern corner of Illinois, the rails spread out like spokes of a wheel in all directions. The iron trails were built on land that had been granted to them by the federal government, which they could then sell to whoever wanted to settle on it. For farmers, there was no better place to establish the country's breadbasket, where its primary commodities are spread out as far as the eye can see: grain, wheat, corn, soybeans, and livestock. Trains would set new standards for moving these goods to market, but some of these standards did not please everyone in the business. This was the golden age of the robber baron, who pressed ahead with ruthlessness, no public pressure, and no government regulation. As in most cases where the gilded business tycoons ruled above all else, the railroads and elevators could set how much they charged for measuring the grade of grain without supervision, and even to refuse farmers their own freight cars to ship out their own goods. In protest, farmers began coming together to share their grievances at how the railroads were pricing their farms out of business. They formed the National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, calling themselves the Grangers. The task of moving all this grain from the silos to market fell onto 6 major railroads, which laid down miles upon miles of track across the Midwest to connect these farms and industries. They depended on these silos and elevators to earn their bread and butter, making them informally known as Granger Roads. In Iowa, a large percentage of these branch lines were laid down by the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. Here in the state's heartland, the railroad had been a staple of everyday life, to the point when farmers could set their watches to the sound of the lonesome whistle. Once in a while, that lonesome whistle can still be heard across the plains, as the present operator of this line took an extraordinary step to bring the magic of steam to the Corn Belt. This is 6988, a steam locomotive made in China. This locomotive is known technically as the QJ type, which is short for Qianjin, which translates to progress. When this engine rolled out from the Datong works in the Shaanxi province, coal was plentiful and labor was cheap, meaning that the age of steam was well and truly alive in 1988, even 20 years after railroads stateside had dieselized. It wouldn't be until 2005 when the QJs would be replaced by diesels and high-speed trains. 2 of these engines, 6988 and sibling 7081, were acquired by the Railway Development Corporation and imported to the United States. They would settle down on the Iowa Interstate Railroad, which operates former Rock Island trackage between Chicago and Council Bluffs, Iowa. Now living in the care of the Central States Steam Preservation Association, the aptly named Iowa Bolt rolls out from its home base in Newton, Iowa, to various towns along the old Rock Island line. Often, the engine leads fundraising events for these towns' fire departments. where preserving railroad heritage usually falls on volunteer labor, seeing heritage being heralded at the corporate level is something that should always be treasured. Iowa Interstate takes their roots a step further with one of their new General Electric ES-44 diesel locomotives wearing the old red and black paint scheme of its predecessor. This unit wears the Rock Island name as a reminder of days gone by, good or bad. As early as 1867, Grangers in 4 states called upon their governments to rein in the railroad's ruthlessness. Illinois was the first to impose these Granger laws, which cut discrimination between long and short haul rates and regulated the highest price for storing grain to be just, reasonable, and uniform. As the 19th century progressed, more Granger laws were being passed in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Initially, railroads found it hard to cope with a tighter watch on their business, which led to rising tensions between shippers and movers. In 1886, a clash erupted between the Wabash Railroad and Illinois' Granger laws, in which the railroad was caught charging for moving passengers and freight at the same high rates over short and long distances. Found guilty by the state court, the Wabash would take their case all the way to the Supreme Court, which called the state's laws unconstitutional because the state wanted to control freight traffic outside of the state lines. In response, Congress passed legislation to create the Interstate Commerce Commission, America's first regulation of its business. Railroad companies now had to publish their rates and were banned from varying charges depending on the route's length. Despite all of its inherent difficulties, railroads were still an integral part of the Midwestern economy, and companies were finding all sorts of avenues to tap into. For the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Sault Ste. Marie, often referred to as the Soo Line, their niche was in bypassing the congestion in Chicago by connecting the flour millers around the Twin Cities with markets in Canada. Representing their early freight service is Soo Line 282 number 1003. This Mikado operates on a number of specials for Host Railroad, Wisconsin and Southern, both for the public and for the fans. This engine was built in 1913 and still regularly puts on a good show as it races like the wind across Wisconsin's many farmlands and lakes. While agriculture was especially prominent in these states, there were other things that came out of the ground. In the upper reaches of Wisconsin, logging was in especially high demand. logging companies quickly found that the best way to drag their cuts from the camps to the sawmills was with steam, lokis. Today, the old sawmill town of Laona uses steam power for a slightly different purpose. The lumberjack steam train runs seasonally on an isolated stretch of track 2 miles long on the original Laona and Northern, with motive power provided by the 4-spot, a 262 Prairie type built by the Vulcan Iron Works in 1916. Another prominent commodity in these parts is iron ore, mined in the upper reaches of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. They are shipped directly from the mines to the shores of the Great Lakes, where the ore would be dumped from towering steel docks into waiting Laker ships. From here, they would be sailed along the Great Lakes to the steel mills in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. Few Granger Roads held stakes in the Iron Range, but the Burlington route was the biggest Class 1 to haul iron ore. The CB&Q would be joined by other comparatively smaller-sized pikes that dedicated themselves completely to moving this commodity. The strongest of these was the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range, which spread out in between the hills of the Iron Range and Lake Superior. Much of the network today is managed by Canadian National, which still unloads ore at the docks to this day in Duluth. Located nearby at Duluth's Union Depot is the Lake Superior Railroad Museum. All of the major footnotes in the region's family tree is on display here, from the first steam engine to ply the state's rails in 1856 and the elegance from rail travel it brought with it, to the rugged simplicity of freight and maintenance of way equipment, and the modernized horsepower they would have been toted around with. The most prominent of these exhibits is DM&IR 227, commonly known as the Yellowstone. Delivered to Duluth in 1941, this 700,000-pound beast could lug trains of iron ore weighing 8,750 tons, or roughly 115 ore jennies at a time. At its peak, the DM&IR rostered 18 Yellowstones. 3 of them are still with us today. The 227 would last on the roster until 1963, and would be donated 4 years later as a static display. Kind of.
Drive wheel set number 2 on.
At the push of a button, lights come on, original sound recordings are heard, and the rear pair of drive wheels are turned by hydraulics. While a full restoration of this locomotive is unlikely, all of this helps to visualize what it was like to see a Yellowstone in action. Steam still maintains a presence here, and it's even within its own family tree. The 332 is a 280 consolidation type, built by Baldwin in 1906 for lugging freight in and around Duluth. Her career lasted well past most other locomotives of her type, finishing up at the subsidiary Duluth and Northeastern as their 28, before being donated to the museum in 1974. The 332 would be resurrected in 2017, and comes out on select weekends to carry guests along the North Shore Scenic Railroad, which the museum maintains between Union Depot and the town of Two Harbors. Although agriculture wasn't particularly strong this far north, the railroads still had plenty of business to keep busy, with iron ore being an active ingredient in steel, and the logging industry building up houses, businesses, and furnishings. While Illinois and Iowa could feed the world, Wisconsin and Minnesota helped form its building blocks. Moving into the 20th century, railroads were finding themselves with unforeseen competition, as roads were getting paved, and cars and trucks were giving trains a run for their money. Even the Grangers would find ways to avoid getting railroaded. They purchased land through independent agents, worked through mail order catalogs, and manufactured their own equipment. As a new generation of politicians shared more of the Grangers' values, Granger membership began to thin out. The regulation of the country's commerce and its effects on the rail industry did not. When the country dove into World War II, America needed all the might and willpower it could get. With road transportation stifled by gasoline and rubber rationing, railroads had enough coal-fired motive power to move several hundred tons of goods, agriculture, or otherwise. What the railroads needed most, though, was more power to keep them rolling. For most railroads across the continent, the 484 Northern type would be the pinnacle of their roster. They could travel much farther and faster than their pre-war predecessors, with less downtime spent in the roundhouse. Rolling out from the Alco-Schenectady Erecting Hall in 1944, the Milwaukee Road's Class S3 types, like number 261, could be found all over the system, sometimes pulling nearly 100 freight cars across Iowa, other times hustling the Olympian Hiawatha through the non-electrified gap across Idaho and Washington state. Today, the 261 lives in Minneapolis and occasionally romps the rails of the short line Twin Cities and Western with its recreated passenger consist, many of which also herald from the height of the Milwaukee Road's might. On top of that, this was the original Milwaukee Road main line, which stretched all the way to Tacoma, Washington. The 261 is right at home. In their heyday, these locomotives and countless more helped railroads run at their capacity by shifting billions of tons of goods to the Allied forces, at 650 million passengers throughout the decade. When war ended, so did the incentive to invest in otherwise outdated technology. Some railroads would be slower to dieselize than others, but the allure for the steam locomotive continued to linger long after the last fires were dropped by 1960. It seemed that the golden age of railroading itself had disappeared too, as the world had moved on with other forms of mobility. What separated railroads even more were how the government has subsidized these networks for air, water, and roads to get them functioning for the people. When railroads approached the same heads of state for assistance, most of them were turned away. The big picture was especially visible on the Granger Roads, with their hundreds of miles of unprofitable tracks slowly sinking into the ground in the 4 Granger states. The network had fallen so hard behind the times that it was not uncommon for trains to derail while sitting still. Despite their lack of purpose, though, the railroads were not allowed by the ICC to abandon these lines to cut their losses. This was costing some of the Granger Roads dearly. The Rock Island line had especially fallen flat after a merger with the Union Pacific had fallen through, and the Milwaukee Road suffered through mismanagement and losses tied to a miscalculation on its Pacific Coast extension. By contrast, the Burlington, as well as the Chicago and Northwestern, held up by absorbing competition with mergers, along with lessons learned from their surroundings and better disciplined companies that they interchanged with. The world of transportation in 1880 had evolved so much over the past century, the seemingly gentle rulings of the Granger era were now strangling the railroads themselves. It was Congress's signing of the Staggers Act in 1980 that cleared the obstructions. With the ICC's authority reduced, the railroad rate system was loosened up and certain bargaining methods were eliminated. Railroads were freed from the burdensome branch lines, leaving their paths to be reclaimed by the earth. Those that still showed economic potential were spun off into their own independent short lines, who charge reasonable rates with the customer and interchange their goods with the national rail network to send their goods anywhere in the country. Some of these lines have found new life by showing off the industry's history. Tourist railroads like the North Shore Scenic Railway, the Lumberjack Steam Train, and museums like IRM are all built on grounds that were previously deemed expendable by their previous owners, and now are thriving as destinations for tourism. Even the Grangers are still prominent today, as a fraternal organization leading the charge for legislation on agriculture. When harvest time comes in the fall, solid strings of covered hoppers carry grain, wheat, and soybeans to market, more energy efficiently and environmentally friendly than by trucking. The country's attitude towards rail may be slow to change, but the goal of providing viable transportation for the American people has remained constant. It is by the innovation of today's technology that railroads are running competitively against other modes of movement, while it is by the preservation of their legacy, whether by the railroads themselves or by nonprofit volunteers, that show the long and bumpy road it took to reach this moment in time. A road that is nonetheless getting smoother.